Good morning. Welcome once again. My name is Katherine Ferguson, and today we are sitting in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee room on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. This morning we are at a hearing presented by the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee for African Affairs. The chairman of this subcommittee is Senator Dick Clark, a Democrat from Iowa. The subject this morning is Angola. I think if we were to say what is the question before the subcommittee and perhaps before the Congress and the people of this country, it is, why is this country involved in Angola at all? Why has the CIA been channeling funds, something to the tune of about $32 million over the last year, to two factions fighting in the Angolan Civil War, that is the FNLA and UNITA. Those are two factions fighting against a third faction, the Popular Movement, which is receiving backing from, among other countries, the Soviet Union and Cuba. Today, our witness is the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who is due to arrive in the hearing room at 10:30. There is no sign of the Secretary of State yet. However, we have an absolutely packed hearing room. There is not even standing room, no SRO for this hearing today. We've got it full. We have member of the Washington Press Corps filling the press gallery here, and we even have a few senators here already. I spoke to Chairman Clark earlier to get a sense of what time we begin. I saw Senator Joe Biden, a Democrat from Delaware, come in. This is the first time, I think, that we have carried live this particular subcommittee. I can't be sure of that. I haven't been with Pacifica that long. Certainly it's the first time since I have been with them. The Senator Clark from Iowa, has expressed some great concern about American involvement in Angola at all, and he called these hearings. In fact, he announced the hearings in January and said that he wants to hear from high members of the administration, of our government, to know and to find out in a public forum why this country has been channeling funds to two factions fighting in the Angolan Civil War. To bring you up to date, or to go over some of the recent events, this conflict and our involvement in this conflict has certainly been a big issue on Capitol Hill. Just the other day, I think it was on Tuesday, I believe, the House of Representatives went along with the decision made in December by the Senate to ban the spending of money for covert military aid to the two factions. This is money that was to go to the CIA and presumably then to be channeled for military aid to these two factions. The money was contained within a $112.3 billion defense bill. This is the appropriations for the Defense Department, for the Pentagon, during fiscal year 76, and it was believed that $28 million was hidden within that bill somewhere and was supposed to go to the CIA, and it was then believed this money was going to go to Angola. Well, led by Senator John Tunney of California and also Senator Dick Clark, the chairman of this subcommittee, the Senate added an amendment to the bill on December 19th and said, no, we don't want that money spent in that way. Then it came before the House just the other day, and the House, in a rather large vote, let me see if I have the numbers. I can't find the numbers. Anyway, it was an overwhelming vote that the House decided they were going to back the Senate in its decision. When asked why he thought the House overwhelmingly backed the Senate decision, House Minority Leader John Rhodes of Arizona explained that he believed the high vote was due to a lingering fear of getting involved in another Vietnam. And that has certainly been a subject or a means of discussing this, the fear that a small amount of CIA money going into a foreign civil war could lead eventually to another Vietnam, and Congress wanted to get in on the takeoff, so to speak, and be able to say whether or not it wanted to support that. So that's one reason that that's the reason that John Rhodes, House Minority Leader, Republican from Arizona, gave. Another reason for the vociferousness of the Congress on this issue might be the whole question of the CIA's covert operations. We've just spent the last year listening to and reading about three different investigations of the CIA and other intelligence operations. Quite a number of CIA covert operations have been exposed, both past and present, and it could be, this is just one idea I've had, that when this operation was made known to members of Congress, they felt that now is the time, having learned about how the CIA works and being called to exert their own influence, maybe this was the time to say no. We don't want this particular operation to keep going. One of the recommendations that's being made by the Senate Intelligence Committee, and it's being made to the Senate to take up for a possible law, is to make sure that the Congress is told in advance of covert operations. Now, in December of 1974, the Congress passed something called the Hughes-Ryan Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act, and this amendment said that the President was to tell the Congress about each covert operation that is, quote, important to the national security of the United States. That means that the President can okay funds for covert operations as long as he deems such operations are important to the national security of the United States. Perhaps today, the senators on this panel will ask the Secretary of State why our involvement, or why is the Angolan Civil War important to the national security of the United States? That could be a question. We'll see later. But at any rate, this Hughes-Ryan Amendment also required the President to report the details of any covert action project in a, quote, timely fashion to the Congress of the United States. In fact, they report to 6 subcommittees. Various intelligence agencies report to 6 different congressional committees on the question of covert actions. But this, in a timely fashion, has also been a problem for the Congress because it seems as if the intelligence agencies or various government officials tend to tell the Congress about a covert operation after it's gotten underway, not beforehand. Senator Frank Church, if he had his way, would have the Congress enact a law which says the administration has to tell Congress before such an operation takes place. In that way, maybe the Congress can do something about it. If a congressional committee, for instance, doesn't have actual veto power over covert operations, Senator Church suggested the other day, last week, that the Congress does have the power of the purse. And if the President wanted to go ahead with a covert operation, well, maybe the Congress should just take away the money. That was one idea. At any rate, the question of covert operations in general is certainly something on the minds of members of Congress right now, and the question of the CIA's covert military aid to Angola is certainly in the forefront of what they're thinking about right now. So we are here today to hear from the Secretary of State on the question of Angola. It will be one of the first public forums which the Secretary of State has attended to discuss this issue. He held a press conference several weeks ago on the issue, but to date I do not believe he has come to an open hearing on Capitol Hill before the public, before live radio, as it were, to discuss why we are there. To go into a little background about Angola, I am now taking this information from a report made by the Center for National Security Studies here in Washington. The neighbors of Angola in Africa are, among others, Zaire, which used to be the Congo, Belgian Congo. Zambia is one of the neighbors. Namibia is another neighbor. Angola has a large sea coast, and it also produces coffee, sugar, cotton, tobacco. It also has oil and diamonds and iron ore. In fact, Gulf Oil Corporation had a subsidiary in northern or in part of Angola, and until a few months ago, due to a contract it had, Gulf was giving royalty payments to the government in the part of Angola where this subsidiary was located. Well, that happened to be that part of Angola where the subsidiary was located happened to be and still is controlled by the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, which is the faction which the United States is not supporting. So after a request by the State Department, Gulf Oil, finding itself in the unfortunate position of actually, in essence, through giving royalty payments, supporting a group of people who the United States was opposing through military aid to its enemies, did withdraw its royalty payments and is said to have put the payments in an escrow account, have put them in the bank to wait until that time when a resolution is made. The country is approximately 481,000 square miles. It has a population of approximately 6 million people. It was a Portuguese colony For 500 years, it was granted independence on November 11th, 1975. It was after that Day of Independence that this particular civil war, this conflict broke out, but the actual conflict in Angola is much older. The three groups which are now fighting each other, or rather the FNLA and UNITA, have a alliance and allied against the popular movement. They have been struggling individually against the Portuguese government for many, many years. The FNLA has been fighting since approximately 1961. It is headed by Holden Roberto, said to be the brother-in-law of Zaire's head of state, President Mobutu. And UNITA has been in a struggle against the Portuguese since about 1966. Its head is Jonas Savimbi. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The MPLA also has been organized for some long time. Its head is Dr. Antonio Agostinho Neto. So I have seen the Secretary of State. He is now talking to Senator Dick Clark, the chairman of this subcommittee. For those of you who are interested and keep tabs on this kind of thing, Senator Clark from Iowa, a Democrat, was recently given a perfect rating by the Americans for Democratic Action, a group which keeps track of how congresspersons vote, how they vote on different issues. And according to the ADA standards, Senator Clark had a perfect voting record. I see him sitting down. Members of his subcommittee are with him. It looks as if things are starting to begin. I will turn you over to Senator Clark and the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. As soon as Mr. Kissinger, there comes the gavel. Mr. Kissinger is seated. Here's Senator Clark.
Mr. Secretary, we appreciate your willingness to come today to explain publicly the United States' involvement in the Civil War in Angola. Many of us have long believed that the United States should not make a serious commitment of its resources and prestige to the conflict without a full public debate. Your appearance today is a necessary first step in formulating an Angola policy which all Americans can understand and Congress can hopefully support. And during the course of these hearings, the committee will examine the administration's policy of providing military assistance to factions in the Angola Civil War. On February 3rd, we will discuss with a representative of the Department of Defense the strategic importance of Angola. And we'll hear testimony of non-governmental experts on the impact of this conflict on United States-Soviet relations. On February 4th, we will hear the testimony of Americans familiar with Angola and the situation there, and on February 6th, the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs will testify on the impact of Angola on our relations with the remainder of Africa. And later through the year, we will be holding hearings on other areas of Africa, other problems of Africa. Both houses have now overwhelmingly voted to prohibit the use of military appropriations for continued CIA activity in Angola, with a majority of both parties in both houses supporting that prohibition. It would be a serious mistake for the administration to continue assistance to the factions without further congressional approval. And any future approval will depend on the answers to certain fundamental questions about the administration's Angola policy, which we hope to address ourselves to here today. Probably the most important question is what is at stake for the United States in Angola. There is reason to question whether the Soviet Union will gain a permanent foothold in Angola if the faction it backs wins. African nations have demonstrated time and again that they are independent, nationalistic, and non-aligned. This has been true even of those nations which have most reason to be grateful to one of the superpowers. Just recently, Mozambique denied the Soviet Union base privileges and publicly accused it of pushing too hard, in spite of generous Soviet assistance to Mozambique's liberation struggle over the last decade. The MPLA has repeatedly asserted its commitment to non-alignment, and Angola is a country wealthy enough to maintain its independence of outside donors. After 500 years of colonial rule and more than a decade of liberation struggle, it is unlikely that a new government in Angola will give up its hard-fought freedom simply to become a Soviet satellite. Undoubtedly, the influence on Angola of other African states experiencing the same process of economic and political development will be much stronger than the influence of either the United States or the Soviet Union. There are no significant strategic interests of either the United States or the Soviet Union in Angola. Administration representatives have repeatedly, and I believe accurately, assured us that the United States is not in Angola to protect either strategic, military, or economic interests. Nor has any case been made for this being an ideological conflict, since Communist China, Communist Russia again find themselves on opposing sides. It is most frequently argued that what is at stake for the United States in Angola is our credibility. The President has stated that if the United States does not respond to the Soviet and Cuban intervention in Angola, quote, we will send a message of irresolution not only to the leaders of African nations, but to the United States allies and friends throughout the world, end of quote. Now, this assumption that a victory by the Soviet-backed faction will prove that the United States does not have the will to defend the world against Soviet aggression must be seriously examined, and I'm sure we'll do that here today. Angola has not traditionally relied on the United States for protection. In fact, while our newly found friends in Angola were fighting for their independence against Portuguese colonialism, the United States chose to ignore that struggle, their struggle, and continue economic and military assistance to Portugal. We must certainly ask whether it is wise policy to react to Soviet actions any place in the world, whether it involves our strategic or economic interests or not. If we follow this policy, it means that we must react even if the Soviets are themselves making a mistake. In short, it means that we are indeed the policemen of the world, and that our policy is not an independent, but rather a reactive one, determined by our adversary. In my judgment, the United States would be a more credible ally if we defined our own interests and did not become bogged down in conflicts of little real importance to us. The assumption that the United States is merely reacting to a Soviet initiative in Angola is itself at least open to question. According to reports, the 40 Committee authorized $300,000 in assistance to the FNLA in January of 1975. This is a small amount, but it is difficult to be sure that the Soviets so perceived it before their more significant escalation in March. President Mobutu, a recipient of substantial United States economic and military assistance in recent years, had been aiding the FNLA much earlier and might well have been increasing his assistance in anticipation of independence as well. Now, I conclude that trying to determine who did what first in support of liberation movements in Angola is at least as difficult as answering which came first, the chicken or the egg. Another essential question that this committee and Congress must try to answer before authorizing any further assistance for Angola is what it will accomplish. The Soviet Union has already provided $200 million in assistance, and Cubans have sent 11,000 troops. The Russians have 400 advisors, these by our own estimates. It is unlikely that these levels of assistance can be balanced by another $9 million in defense appropriation, or the $28 million more which has been requested, or even another 50 or 100 million. How can more dollars offset troops and technical advisors? The President has said that he will not send troops, advisors, or mercenaries. Do we really improve our credibility by escalating the conflict further only to back off later? I hope that the Secretary will tell us today how the money blocked by the passage of the Tunney Amendment, $9 million, would have been used to successfully offset the Russian and Cuban forces. We must also examine what this commitment is costing us in terms of our relations with the rest of Africa. Our identification with South Africa's intervention in Angola will not help our relations with the black African states, which regard racial domination in South Africa as the most serious problem of their continent. South Africa's intervention in the Angola conflict is regarded as an effort to assure that the government which comes to power does not challenge South Africa's illegal occupation of Namibia or its internal apartheid practices. The United States cannot afford to be associated with this effort to preserve minority rule in South Africa. The intervention of both the United States and the Soviet Union in Angola is bound to be viewed in the rest of Africa as superpowers seeking to exploit a civil war in Africa for their own advantage. President Kaunda stated at the OAU session last month, whilst these superpowers are trumpeting the end of the Cold War era in their bilateral relations, they are at the same time showing the seeds of discord in Africa. Now, the heavy-handed methods of the Soviet Union in Angola, the use of their military might, will, in my judgment, have its own reward, just as it has throughout Africa, in country after country. And so will ours, if we simply follow them. And one final point. I do hope that no one will interpret our opposition to shipping military equipment to Angola as an evidence of isolationism. Quite the contrary. We believe much of our past problem in Africa has been the isolationist policies which this and previous administrations have followed. Had we ever shown any interest in Southern Africa before this military action might have seemed more credible. The fact is that our only serious interest in Africa has been, by extension, of the Cold War. The Angolan intervention is perhaps only the best example. Africa deserves a policy. And, Mr. Secretary, these questions are being raised not only by this committee, but by the overwhelming majority of both houses of Congress who have voted against further U.S. military assistance in Angola. Frankly, we question how successful a foreign policy can be that has neither congressional nor public support. We welcome the opportunity to examine them with you and to begin the long overdue public discussion of the administration's Angola policy. We've been involved in the Angolan Civil War for a year, and you are the first public witness to testify before the Congress, certainly before the Senate, on our policy there. Now, I think we would all agree with the goals that the administration has expressed: an end to foreign intervention in Angola and an African solution to the conflict. But, Mr. Secretary, is it credible for you to condemn outside interference in Angola and Africa while chastising the Congress for not allowing you to interfere as an outsider? Senator Percy.
Chairman, I would first like to simply say that Senator Ferguson, who is the ranking minority member on this subcommittee, intended to be here but has been unavoidably detained in arriving at the Capitol this morning. I think there's no question, Mr. Secretary, about the anxiety of the American people to hear what you have to say on this issue. It's been a long time since we've had hearings with as many people trying to get in as this morning. And it's little wonder, because we've had such a contradictory set of statements that appeared in the press as to what America's involvement actually is, what the cost of that involvement has been, what the degree of it. We've had the administration deny that we're taking any direct role, and yet we have advertisements in the Washington papers appearing asking for private organizations to get mercenaries and volunteers from the United States to go down to Angola. The question is, how deep are we getting involved, officially or unofficially? This comes at a particularly important time, Mr. Secretary. I would like to say to you that I have not seen in a long time a deeper desire on the part of the Senate and the members of this committee to reach accord with the administration on foreign policy. I don't think we've ever been closer on NATO. We've not had the big fight about withdrawing troops at all. We've come together on that issue as a result of our reasoning together. We certainly have come together on the issue of executive agreements and treaties, and what was accomplished in Spain, I think, was an outstanding example of cooperation between the executive branch and the legislative, and I hope we will overwhelmingly approve this treaty after we've heard all of the facts involved in it. Certainly in SALT and military assistance in the Middle East, we're working very closely together. But once again, the country is saying, is this another Vietnam? How deep are we getting? What are we getting involved in? Are we being sucked into the quicksand down in Africa in a civil war? And I think the need for your testimony this morning, the desire we have to get the facts, to share them with the American people, and then see if we can't carve out a common policy based on an understanding of the same facts, evidences certainly your appearance here this morning. We're grateful for your testimony, and we look forward to it.
Charles Percy, a Republican from Illinois. Joseph Biden is now speaking, a Democrat from Delaware.
With your remarks and emphasize 3 points that I have not had a chance to read the Secretary's full statement, which we had before us, and I'm anxious to hear it. But I'm very concerned as to whether or not we are in fact being involved in a conflict which we can't win. One of the things I'm curious about is even if in fact we adhere to the administration's request, whether or not there was any possibility under any circumstances to in fact be successful. And I questioned after a number of so-called secret briefings by the department and by the CIA as to what our objectives are. What were they? What are they now? They changed every time not every time, but on 3 occasions they changed from what I was told, what our ultimate objective was in Angola. And in closing of my brief opening statement, I did have a chance to read the first page of the Secretary's opening statement. And with regard to no foreshadowing of any opposition to the principal involvement, I think if the Secretary will have an opportunity at a later time to check on that, he will find that both Senator Clark and I believe, way back as far as April, if I'm not mistaken, July expressed an opposition on the record, but that's nitpicking. This is not a newfound issue, and I'm anxious to hear from the Secretary with regard to all the issues raised by the Chairman, but particularly with regard to what is our objective there, even if we agree with the Secretary that we should be involved. What would be the ultimate victory for our foreign policy objective in Angola, even if we agreed, which I happen at this point not to, but I'm prepared to be persuaded by the Secretary. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you. Senator Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since I'm not a member of the subcommittee, I'm here formally as an observer, and I appreciate your invitation to all of us on the committee to come. I look forward with great interest to hearing the Secretary's statement.
Senator Powell.
I, too, am not a member of the subcommittee. Thank you for your hospitality to be here. Look forward to hearing the Secretary, and we'll have a few questions if you will permit them.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Senator McGovern.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not a member of the subcommittee, but I want to commend you on these hearings and also for inviting some of the rest of us to sit in as observers. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, you may proceed in any way you think appropriate.
Mr. Chairman, I have a fairly lengthy statement here. I will delete some paragraphs as I go through it, but I'll stand by the entire statement, except for the one clause to which Senator Biden called my attention, which I tried to delete this morning before he called my attention to it, but it had already been distributed. No, I think it's a fair point, and I think the Chairman's article this morning brought home to me that that particular clause is perhaps more appropriately deleted from the formal statement, and I'd like to request the press to do that. I welcome this opportunity to explain the global significance of what is happening in Angola, the events that brought us to this point, the United States objectives, and the major consequences which can result. The Soviet Union's massive and unprecedented intervention in the internal affairs of Africa, with nearly $200 million of arms, and its military technicians and advisors, with 11,000 Cuban combat troops, and with substantial sea and airlift and naval cover in adjacent waters, is a matter of urgent concern. Not only are the interests of the countries directly affected at stake, but also the interests of all nations in preserving global stability, which is the precondition for all else mankind aspires to accomplish. In recent years, the United States has sought to help build a new international order, less tied to traditional patterns of power balances. It was the United States which took the initiative in seeking to resolve the most dangerous problems of our time by negotiation and cooperation, rather than by force of arms. It was we who insisted on the historical necessity that this period required a more stable relationship between the two nations possessing the capacity to destroy civilization. We have sought, and with some success, to build more constructive relations with the USSR across a broad range, to contain strategic arms, to institutionalize cooperation in economic, scientific, and cultural fields, to reduce tensions in areas where our vital interests impinge on one another. We have done so in the face of some considerable domestic criticism, because we've been convinced that the classical pattern of accumulating marginal advantages must be overcome, and mankind must build more constructive patterns if catastrophe is to be avoided. No one has been more dedicated than the President and I to working for these principles. But our efforts have been founded upon one fundamental reality. Peace requires a sense of security, and security depends upon some form of equilibrium. That equilibrium is impossible unless the United States remains both strong and determined to use its strength when required. This is our historic responsibility, for no other nation has the capacity to act in this way. While constantly seeking opportunities for conciliation, we need to demonstrate to potential adversaries that cooperation is the only rational alternative. Any other course will encourage the trends it seeks to accommodate. A challenge not met today will tempt far more dangerous crises tomorrow. If a continent such as Africa, only recently freed from external oppression, can be made the arena for great power ambitions, if immense quantities of arms can affect far-off events, if large expeditionary forces can be transported at will to dominate virtually helpless peoples, then all we have hoped for in building a more stable and rational international order is in jeopardy. The history of the post-war period should give us pause. Military aggression, direct or indirect, has frequently been successfully dealt with, but never in the absence of a local balance of forces. U.S. policy in Angola has sought our friends to assist our friends to achieve this balance. Angola represents the first time since the aftermath of World War II that the Soviet Union has moved militarily at long distances to impose a regime of its choice. It is the first time that the United States has failed to respond to Soviet military moves outside their immediate orbit. And it is the first time that Congress has halted the executive's action while it was in the process of meeting this kind of threat. Thus, to claim that Angola is not an important country, or that the United States has no important interests there, begs what is for us the principal question. The objectives which the United States has sought in Angola have not been aimed at defending or acquiring intrinsic interests in that country. We are not opposing any particular faction. And I might add that we established immediately relations with Frelimo in Mozambique when the chairman visited there, as a matter of fact, even though its purposes are not particularly friendly to the United States, and even though it had received some outside support from the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, but because we considered it an essentially indigenous movement. We could develop constructive relations with any Angolan government. We have never been involved militarily in Angola. We are not so involved now. We emphatically do not seek to be militarily involved in the future. Our objective is clear and simple: to help those countries and those groups within Angola, those African countries and those groups within Angola that would resist external aggression by providing them with needed financial support. Those whom we seek to assist share our hopes for negotiated solutions and for African self-determination. They played a larger role than the MPLA in striving toward Angolan independence. Our deepest concern is for global stability. If the United States is seen to emasculate itself in the face of massive, unprecedented Soviet and Cuban intervention, what will be the perception of leaders around the world as they make decisions concerning their future security? Will they feel they can proceed to develop their nations in an international climate which fosters cooperation and self-determination? How will they adjust their conduct in the context of such events? And what conclusion will an unopposed superpower draw when the next opportunity for intervention beckons? America's modest, direct, strategic and economic interests in Angola are not the central issue. The question is whether America maintains the resolve to act responsibly as a great power. Let there be no mistake about it. The culprits in the tragedy that is now unfolding in Angola are the Soviet Union and its client state, Cuba. But I must note with some sadness that the executive has been deprived of indispensable flexibility in formulating a foreign policy which we strongly believe to be in our national interest. The crucial truth is that a stable relationship with the Soviet Union based on mutual restraint will be achieved only if Soviet lack of restraint carries the risk of counteraction. The consequences may well be far-reaching and substantially more painful than the course we have recommended. When one great power attempts to obtain special positions of influence based on military interventions, the other power is sooner or later bound to act to offset this advantage in some other place or manner. This will inevitably lead to a chain of action and reaction, typical of other historic eras in which great powers maneuvered for advantage, only to find themselves sooner or later embroiled in a major crisis and often in open conflict. It is precisely this pattern that must be broken and that we want to break if a lasting easing of tensions is to be achieved. And if it is not broken now, we will face harder choices and higher costs later on. In Angola, we have consistently advocated a government representing all three factions. We have never opposed participation by the Soviet-backed Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, the MPLA. What we do oppose is the massive Soviet and Cuban intervention and their expressed aim of denying the other two groups any part in governing their country. Our overriding goal has been to assure that the Africans shape their own destiny and that traditional colonialism not be replaced by a more modern version. Since October, we have consistently offered to stop all military supplies on our side, provided all other countries would do the same thing, and have made repeated proposals for an end of all foreign military intervention. Let me briefly recount the course of events that has led us to this point. And I recognize that in going over the events of a year or more, it is extremely difficult to give an absolutely unbiased account, and it will always be possible to find this or that individual whose perspective might be different. This is how it looked from where I sat. In 1961, the United States declared its support for self-determination in Portugal's African territories. At the time, the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, FNLA, was a leading force in the struggle for Angolan independence. Looking to the future, we sought to develop a relationship with the FNLA through providing it some financial, non-military assistance. The USSR had already established links with the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, through the Portuguese Communist Party. The MPLA began military action against the Portuguese in the mid-1960s. The National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, an offshoot of the FNLA, also began to fight in the late 1960s. Although these various uncoordinated insurgency efforts caused considerable difficulties for Portugal, they posed no serious military threat to the dominance of Portuguese military forces in Angola. However, the overthrow of the Portuguese government in April 1974 and the growing strength of the Portuguese Communist Party apparently convinced Moscow that a revolutionary situation was developing in Angola. The Soviet Union began to exploit this situation in the fall of 1974 through the shipment of arms and equipment to the MPLA. The United States at the same time received requests for support from other Angolan elements, but turned them down. The prospect of an independent Angola was clouded by the intense rivalry of the FNLA, MPLA, and UNITA. Concerned about the three factions' failure to end their bitter quarrel, leaders of other African countries prevailed upon them to come together with Portugal and seek agreement. This effort led to the Alvor Accord of January 1975. Under its terms, a transitional coalition government was to be established and charged with preparing for a peaceful turnover of power by integrating the military forces of the three movements, writing a constitution, and organizing an election to take place before independence, scheduled for November 11, 1975. This was the moment when Portugal was trying to organize a peaceful transition to independence for the exercise of restraint by all outside parties. And this is why the United States did not support UNITA and had only the most modest support for the FNLA. But the USSR and the Portuguese communists decided to put the MPLA in power through stepped-up shipments of arms. With this kind of encouragement, the MPLA had little incentive to fulfill the terms of the Alvor Accord, which would have prevented it from dominating any future coalition government. It is no coincidence that major violence broke out in March 1975 when large shipments of Soviet arms began to arrive. Thousands of infantry weapons, machine guns, bazookas, and rockets. On March 23rd, the first of repeated military clashes between the MPLA and FNLA occurred. They increased in frequency in April, May, and June, when deliveries of communist arms and equipment, including mortars and armored vehicles, escalated by air and sea. In May, the MPLA forced the FNLA out of the areas north and east of Luanda, and in June, took effective control of Cabinda. On July 9th, all-out civil war began, when the MPLA attacked the FNLA and UNITA, driving both organizations out of Luanda, thereby ending the short-lived coalition government. By mid-July, the military situation radically favored the MPLA. As the military position of the FNLA and UNITA deteriorated, the governments of Zaire and Zambia grew more and more concerned about the implications for their own security. Those two countries turned to the United States for assistance in preventing the Soviet Union and Cuba from imposing a solution in Angola, becoming a dominant influence in South Central Africa, and threatening the stability of the area. And I want to stress that until this point, no military assistance of any kind was given by the United States to any faction in the Angolan province. In August, intelligence reports indicated the presence of Soviet and Cuban military advisors, trainers, and troops, including the first Cuban combat troops. If statements by Cuban leaders are to be believed, a large Cuban military training program began in Angola in June, and Cuban advisors were there before that. By September, the MPLA offensive had forced UNITA out of several major central and southern Angolan cities. In early September, the poorly equipped UNITA forces turned in desperation to South Africa for assistance against the MPLA, which was overrunning UNITA's ethnic areas in the south. South Africa responded by sending in military equipment and some military personnel without consultation with the United States. The UNITA forces launched a successful counteroffensive, which swept the MPLA out of the southern and most of the central part of Angola. In October, massive increases in Soviet and Cuban military assistance began to arrive. More Cuban troops were ferried to Angola. Cuba inaugurated its own airlift of troops in late October, and the MPLA declared itself the government of Angola in violation of the Alvor Accord. In the hope of holding a dangerously escalating situation, the United States, using the leverage provided by our financial support, which had started in August, undertook a wide range of diplomatic activity, pointing toward a summit of the Organization of African Unity scheduled for January 1976. Starting in October, we made several overtures to the Soviet Union, expressing our concern over the scale and purpose of their intervention. We offered to use our influence to bring about the cessation of all foreign military assistance and to encourage an African solution if they would do the same. Their responses were evasive, but not totally negative. We began to voice our concerns and our limited objectives publicly. Beginning with a speech by me in Detroit on November 24th, we pointed out that continuation of an interventionist policy by the Soviet Union must inevitably threaten our other relationships, and that our sole objective was an African resolution of an African problem. I briefed the NATO foreign ministers and obtained significant understanding and support. Throughout this period, the United States principles for a solution to the Angolan tragedy were unambiguous and straightforward. They are: Angola is an African problem and should be left to Africans to solve. Foreign military involvement only escalates and prolongs the warfare there and should be ended. OAU efforts to promote a ceasefire should be supported. The United States pursues no unilateral interest in Angola and is exclusively concerned with seeing the people of that country live in peace and independence. Angola should be insulated from great power conflict. Our diplomacy was effective so long as we maintained the leverage of a possible military balance. African determination to oppose Soviet and Cuban intervention was becoming more and more evident. On December 9th, President Ford made a formal proposal to the Soviet government through their ambassador, proposing the end of all foreign military intervention and of the shipment of all foreign military equipment. It appeared as if the Soviet Union had begun to take stock. The airlift was interrupted from December 9th until December 24th. By mid-December, we were hopeful that the OAU would provide a framework for eliminating the interference of outside powers by calling for an end of their intervention. And we made clear in advance to all parties concerned, including the Soviet Union and all African states, that we would immediately accept such a solution. At that point, the impact of our domestic debate overwhelmed the possibilities of diplomacy. After the vote to block any further aid to Angola, the Cubans more than doubled their forces, and Soviet military aid was resumed on an even larger scale. As the scope of Soviet-Cuban intervention increased, the cooperativeness of their diplomacy declined. The weight of Soviet aid and advisors and the massive Soviet expeditionary force began to tip the scales of battle in December. By this point, most of the effective fighting for the MPLA was being done by Cubans. It was clear that the USSR, Cuba, and the MPLA hoped to achieve a decisive military victory on the eve of the Organization of African Unity's extraordinary summit conference in Addis Ababa a few weeks ago. Yet notwithstanding their reverses, the FNLA UNITA forces still control about 70% of the territory and 70% of the population of Angola at the time of the conference. At the summit, 22 members of the OAU advocated recognition of the MPLA, but they were opposed in an unusual demonstration of solidarity by 22 other members who held out for a more balanced resolution that would include the following points: an immediate ceasefire, condemnation of South Africa and immediate withdrawal of South African forces, withdrawal of all other foreign forces, an end to the supply of arms of all factions, and fifth, reconciliation of all factions with the aim of establishing a government of national unity. The United States regarded this program as reasonable and responsive to the facts of the situation. We were prepared to accept it then, and we are prepared to accept it now. But the Soviet Union and Cuba urged MPLA supporters to refuse to accept this solution. This, then, is a brief history of the significance of Angola. In elaborating further the United States position, I would like to respond directly to some of the issues raised in the current debate. Our principal objective has been to respond to an unprecedented application of Soviet power, achieved in large part through the expeditionary force of a client state. During 1975, the Soviet Union is estimated to have contributed nearly $200 million worth of military assistance to Angola. This equals the entire amount of all military aid from all sources to sub-Saharan Africa in 1974. A total of at least 46 flights of Soviet heavy and medium military transports have ferried Soviet military equipment from the USSR to Luanda and Congo-Brazzaville, while a steady stream of Soviet and Cuban aircraft has continued to bring Cuban troops across the Atlantic. Soviet naval involvement, clearly related to Angolan events, have continued in West African waters for several weeks. The implications of Cuba's unprecedented and massive intervention cannot be ignored. It is a geopolitical event of considerable significance. For the first time, Cuba has sent an expeditionary force to another country on another continent. About 11,000 Cuban military personnel have been sent to Angola. If allowed to proceed unchecked, this blatant intervention cannot but carry with it far-reaching implications, including the impact it will have on the attitudes and future conduct of nations of this hemisphere. Indeed, friend and foe alike cannot fail to contrast the sending of a large Cuban expeditionary force with our apparent inability to provide even indirect financial assistance. We have been asked why we do not respond with other pressures on the Soviet Union. The first answer is that many of the links the administration has tried to forge, such as trade and credit, which would have provided incentives for restraint and levers for penalty, have been precluded by earlier congressional actions. But above all, economic measures take too much time to affect a fast-moving situation like Angola. Any longer-term impact would be of little use to those immediately threatened. Still, we have made clear that a continuation of actions like those in Angola must threaten the entire web of Soviet-U.S. relations. In this sense, both the negotiations and the overall relations are in long-term jeopardy unless restraint is exercised. But there is no substitute for a local balance. Indirect pressures can succeed only if rapid local victories are foreclosed. The Questions then come down to this. Do we really want the world to conclude that if the Soviet Union chooses to intervene in a massive way, and if Cuban or other troops are used as an expeditionary force, the United States will not be able to muster the unity or resolve to provide even financial assistance? Can those faced with such a threat and with hope of assistance from us be expected to resist? Do we want our potential adversaries to conclude that in the event of future challenges, America's internal divisions are likely to deprive us of even minimal leverage over events of global significance? Our second objective has been to help our friends in Black Africa who oppose Soviet and Cuban intervention. Only in recent years has Africa become free of great power rivalry. It must not once again become an arena in which the ambitions of outside powers are pursued. We are told that we need not concern ourselves because in the final analysis, and at some indefinite time in the future, African nationalism will reassert itself and drive out foreign influence. Even were this to be true, it still ignores the fact that governments under pressure will be forced to yield whenever a threat develops. Those who are threatened cannot afford to wait for history. They must decide whether to resist or to adjust. Advice which counsels confidence in the verdict of history is a mockery to those who are concerned for the fate of their country today. History rarely helps those who do not help themselves. Some charge that we have acted in collusion with South Africa. That is not true. We do not view South African intervention any more benevolently than we do the intervention of other outside powers. Indeed, we have formally proposed that the removal of outside forces begin with those of South Africa, and we have asked in vain for an indication of how soon thereafter Soviet and Cuban forces would be withdrawn. We are firmly convinced that had there been no outside interference initiated by the Soviet Union, the Africans would have found their own solution. No single movement would have been strong enough to take over. The resulting solution would have been more representative of the people of Angola than a government imposed by an outside power and representing only a minority faction. The means we have chosen have been limited and explained to Congress. Our immediate objective was to provide leverage for diplomatic efforts to bring about what we considered a just and peaceful solution. They were not conceived unilaterally by the United States. They represented support to friends who requested our financial assistance. We chose covert means because we wanted to keep our visibility to a minimum. We wanted the greatest possible opportunity for an African solution. We felt that overt assistance would elaborate a formal doctrine justifying great power intervention. Aside from the technical issues, such as in what budgetary category this aid should be given and how it could be reconciled with legislative restrictions against the transfer of U.S. arms by recipients. We chose a covert form of response, and indeed we chose to act only with the greatest reluctance. In doing so, we were determined to adhere to established standards of executive legislative consultation. 8 congressional committees were briefed on 24 separate occasions. We sought in these briefings to determine the wishes of the Congress. While we do not claim that every member approved our action, we had no indication of basic opposition. But I want to emphasize that this is open, obviously, to different interpretations. But this was our reading of the situation. I'm altogether more than 24 senators, about 150 congressmen, and over 100 staff members of both houses were informed. I'm attaching to my statement a list of all of the briefings that were carried out. Mr. Chairman, where are we now? Many of the members of this committee have expressed their general support for our policy of easing tensions with the Soviet Union. We in the executive branch are grateful for that support. But this process of easing tensions cannot be divided into those segments which the Soviets will honor and those which we allow them to ignore. What the United States does when confronted with a blatant challenge like Angola can be of great significance in shaping our future relations with the Soviet Union. A demonstration of lack of resolve could lead the Soviets to great miscalculation, thereby plunging us into a major confrontation, which neither of us wants. The United States must make it clear that our divisions over Angola set no precedent, that this type of action will not be tolerated elsewhere. This must be demonstrated by both the executive and the Congress in our national interest and in the interest of world peace. To the Soviet Union and to Cuba, the administration says, we will continue to make our case to the American public. We will not tolerate wanton disregard for the interest of others and for the cause of world peace. To the American people, the administration says that the time has come to put aside self-accusation and division. Our own country's safety and the progress of mankind depend crucially upon a united and determined America. Today, as throughout 200 years, the world looks to us to stand up for what is right. By virtue of our strengths and our values, we are leaders in the defense of freedom. Without us, there can be neither security nor progress. To the Congress, the administration says that whatever our past disagreements, let the Congress and the executive now resolve to shape a cooperative relationship that will enable the United States to play a responsible international role. Both branches will have to do their share in restoring the kind of nonpartisan support that has served our foreign policy so well in the past. On the issue of Angola, the administration is now considering overt financial aid, and we will soon be consulting with the Congress on this possibility. But whatever that decision, and whatever our past disagreements, let us work together on other issues with an appreciation of the larger interests involved and with a shared sense of national responsibility. A united America cannot be ignored by adversaries. Together we will preserve the independence of those who face the prospect of oppression. Together we can hearten the friends of liberty and promote peace everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for a very detailed, very concise statement. If the committee has no objection, we'll operate under the 10-minute rule. With the lights operating here, I can't see them, but I know they're here, including members of the full committee, so that we will just move along in that way.
You've been listening to the statement by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger.
To start on perhaps a sort of side question. On page 40 of your statement, I think it was, where you say 8 congressional committees were briefed on 24 separate occasions. We sought in these hearings to determine the wishes of Congress. Is it the administration's interpretation of the so-called Hughes-Ryan Amendment that the wishes of Congress are determined in these consultations?
The problem of how to conduct covert operations and the relation to congressional oversight is an extremely complicated one. And it is the administration does not feel that it is legally obliged to follow all the opinions that may be expressed in these congressional briefings, but it would certainly take them seriously. When the issue of assistance to Angola first arose in June and July, we recognized that we were faced with an extremely painful set of alternatives. Nobody in the year of the collapse of our effort in Indochina had any possible interest in being involved again in what could superficially appear like an analogous situation. Nobody in a year of the intelligence investigations had any excessive eagerness to expose this country and to the sort of dispute that might ensue. We examined the pros and cons of the sort of indirect financial assistance that we were providing for about 6 weeks. And then the President decided to proceed to brief the Congress meticulously, and that if out of these briefings there emerged what would appear to us a determined opposition to reconsider our views, to reconsider our policy. While I repeat, I do not say that every member that was briefed expressed support, we did not have the sense that it would lead to a clash between the Congress and the executive. For example, Mr. Chairman, the amendment which you offered was not one which we found incompatible with our purposes. When I briefed the Church Committee in early December last year about what we were doing in Angola, I volunteered that once the additional sums that we were then attempting to reprogram, that is to say, once these $28 million were expended, if any additional funds were required, it was my personal belief that we had come to the end of the covert phase of our action, and we would then have to request additional funds in some overt manner. And therefore, your amendment, Mr. Chairman, was not one that I found incompatible with our policies, because either what we were then doing would lead to a negotiation, which on the whole I expected, or it would demonstrate that the Soviet Union and Cuba were engaged on a degree of massive intervention that required a widespread American public decision before we proceeded with opposing it. So in any event, we would have come to the Congress whenever these $28 million were expended if a negotiation had not developed. Our concern was that events in December, in the middle of an attempted effort to crystallize a negotiation, terminated abruptly something that had been developed over a period of months. And our disagreement is not with the proposition that there must be a limit beyond which covert actions cannot be made compatible with congressional oversight. It was rather with the methods that were chosen in December, which were not actually the ones that you had recommended in your own amendment, which we, as you know, had not actively opposed.
Well, Mr. Secretary, just to pursue this point on advising the committees, or more specifically, to get their wishes, it's my understanding that the members of the committee who were briefed on these after the fact, or whatever the case may be, were not advised that their opinion was being sought. Now, I remember raising that question upon returning from Africa in early September with Director Colby, who said much the same thing that you're saying. We really received very little opposition from this, and my question was whether the people who were being briefed were advised that their opposition was being sought or that their consultation was being sought. It seems to me that it leaves those people who are being briefed in a very difficult position if they are expected to give a yes or a no, or give some indication on every single covert activity that's presented to them, or in the event that they do not do that, they can later be quoted as having said they didn't oppose it. It seems to me that puts them in a difficult position if they're not previously advised that their opposition is going to make a difference.
Of course, Mr. Chairman, my experience with the Congress has been that the members of the Senate and the Congress with whom I deal have not in the past shown an excessive reluctance to express a view, even if the view was not actively solicited. But I hope that's the case. But I can only speak of the one briefing in which I participated, which was that of the Church Committee, and their views were being actively expressed by the committee. That was well along in the course of the operation. But the question you raise is one that perhaps requires further clarification in elaborating the oversight procedures.
Well, there are other people in the Senate who could speak to that better than I. Let me ask you a brief period of time.
All I can say is that I always asked those who were briefing the congressional committees what reaction they found, and that the President and I thought that the degree of continuation of the action, at least in its early phases, was to some extent dependent on the mood we found in the Congress. But there could have been a misunderstanding.
So that it would be well to assume, those people who are being briefed, to assume that if they don't take opposition on the occasion of the briefing, that it could be interpreted that they may be favorable to it.
Or at least that they will not carry their opposition beyond a certain point.
Yes.
It's not just a question of being favorable. It is a question of whether one actively, by an act of Congress, terminates an action of which one has been well aware.
Fine. Now, I'd like to pursue with you a bit what seems to me to be the principle of foreign policy involved here, as you've described it in some detail in your statement. And I think, if I may just start the question with a quote from the President, which is very much along the same line. He said, "The Senate decision is a deep tragedy for all countries whose security depends on the United States. Ultimately, it will profoundly affect the security of our own country as well. How can the United States, the greatest power in the world, take the position that the Soviet Union can operate with impunity many thousands of miles away with Cuban troops and massive amounts of military equipment, while we refuse any assistance to the majority of the local people who ask only for military equipment to defend themselves?" And you've said much the same throughout your statement. Now, is it therefore the administration's position that the United States must become involved in any conflict in which the Soviet Union is involved seriously if no important strategic interest of the United States is affected and the country in question has not traditionally relied on the United States for protection? I guess what I'm really asking is, does the United States' security depend on our becoming involved in every conflict in which the Soviet Union is providing assistance? And if so, aren't we, in this case, allowing the Soviet Union to define American interests and, in effect, make us reactive in policy rather than determining our own?
Well, the only way you can avoid being reactive with respect to military action is to initiate it yourself.
Well, you may not act at all.
That's right, but if you don't initiate the military actions yourself, then the decision will always be imposed on you in one way or another by the aggressive nation. Now, I would make a distinction between Soviet military assistance and of equipment of some kind and a massive Soviet military operation. I think you will also appreciate that it is very difficult for a Secretary of State to state in public session what the United States will not do, because that will then open up vast areas which seem open for all kinds of adventures. I think we developed a national consensus during the period of the Vietnam War, that in wars of national liberation, which have a largely local origin, the United States will not become involved simply because it prefers one group over another, and it will rely largely on the local forces to achieve their own successes. And therefore, in Mozambique, for example, where the basic orientation of Frelimo is probably not much different from the MPLA, The United States made no effort to affect the course of events, and it's not much different from the MPLA. The United States made no effort to affect the course of events, and as you know, Mr. Chairman, we immediately established diplomatic relations and have sought since then to improve our relationships with them. Similarly, in Angola, during 1974, we had many opportunities to become involved in the support of the two factions that, on the whole, we prefer to the MPLA. But we did not feel that our national interest was sufficiently involved in the struggle within Angola, as long as it was a substantially local struggle, for us to involve ourselves by giving military equipment. And therefore, we only made a grant of $300,000, which went mostly to bicycles, office equipment, and political efforts of the FNLA within the context of the coalition government, which we were supporting as a result of the Alvor Accord. None of it went to for arms. Therefore, I do not believe that the Soviet actions in significantly increasing their military equipment, military support to Angola or to the MPLA, were triggered by American actions. And we gave the Soviet Union many opportunities to back off it. However, when 11,000 Cuban combat troops appear, when the Soviet Union puts into one country the equivalent of all the military equipment that has been sent from all other sources to sub-Saharan Africa, then we are no longer talking of a local struggle. And then we are talking about a situation where if the United States were to say that it will be indifferent, it would do two things. It would tell all countries outside of a traditional orbit that if that sort of pressure appears, they have no choice except to accommodate to it. And secondly, it might tell the Soviet Union that even in areas of traditional concerns of American security, the ability or willingness to react might be minimal. We believe rightly, but we will never be able to prove it, that until the middle of December, the Soviet intervention was at the limit of what was sustainable by covert operation, and that they would have had to make in January the same decision I had already foreshadowed to the Church Committee. That is to say, whether they would put everything at risk by going to the sort of massive intervention that has now developed. Now, I regret that we were not given the opportunity to play this diplomacy to the end to see whether the OAU could be given a constructive given a constructive role. But you asked me the fundamental question. I would say that when Soviet military equipment appears on this massive a scale and is backed by substantial military forces that are in effect Soviet-controlled, then we have a problem in which any president, I would think, of either party would have to ask himself what American security interests are. And I would not want to make a flat judgment based on the traditional role we have played in that country.
Thank you. I have some other questions, but my time is up. Senator Percy.
Secretary Kissinger, I should like to try to determine in the next few minutes the extent of American involvement in Angola, the extent of Chinese involvement, and why they apparently chose to withdraw, and the reaction of Mr. Brezhnev when you presented him and confronted him with the facts, I presume, in just as forceful a manner as you have here in this open testimony. To the extent that you can reveal these publicly, we would appreciate it, but whenever you wish to do so in executive session, that always is acceptable, of course. So far as American involvement is concerned, I'd like to quote your own words that it's an unambiguous and straightforward policy, or has been, that Angola of American policy, that Angola is an African problem and should be left to Africans to solve. You evidenced some, I thought, surprise when I mentioned advertisements for mercenaries. Here is a story from yesterday's Washington Post out of Kinshasa by a Washington Post foreign correspondent, David Ottaway, indicating that UNITA has decided, now that South African troops apparently are being withdrawn, to attempt to replace them with European and American mercenaries. The day before, here was the headline that appeared in the Washington Star based on two investigative reporters who say wanted ex-GIs for Angola war $1,500 a month. And they reprint a classified advertisement asking for veterans with a telephone number. Following that up, apparently the person doing it is Larry Mitchell, a 9-year Army veteran of intelligence and special forces medical work in Vietnam. And when he was asked whether or not CIA money was involved, he said he wouldn't reveal, but he said he wouldn't be surprised if it were coming from the CIA. Who else could afford something this large? Because that's on the public record, I'd like to ask you whether or not the CIA or any American government institution or department or agency is involved in recruiting mercenaries in any official or unofficial capacity, directly or indirectly.
The CIA is not involved in the recruiting of these individuals. It is, of course, possible that in a very indirect way, that is to say that money that has been given to UNITA is then used by UNITA and not by the CIA to recruit people. We do not know exactly what the origin of these advertisements is, but there are some basic facts. First and fundamental is that the United States has offered repeatedly, unconditionally, to work for the removal of all foreign forces without any conditions whatsoever. We have stated publicly that we would work for the prior removal of South African forces as long as we were given some kind of idea when the Cuban and Soviet forces would withdraw. Our basic objective is to leave the issues in Angola to the Angolans. On the other hand, what is now developing in Angola is that almost all of the fighting for the MPLA is done by Cubans. The equipment that they have is too sophisticated to be used by the MPLA forces that are not so highly trained. Therefore, inevitably, those who resist the Cuban forces will need individuals on their side that can use complicated equipment. And this produces the incentive for outsiders.
Are United States government funds being used, though, directly or indirectly, to recruit American mercenaries?
It depends how you define indirectly. I would have to check to know how the UNITA, if this is done for UNITA, is using the funds. No American funds are being used by American agencies, nor do American agencies supervise this part of the effort. But I would like to check precisely whether I can give you
I would appreciate that very much. And I particularly asked the question as a matter of principle, Mr. Secretary, because I was startled last week when former Secretary Dean Russ testified in answer to a question that I put to him in the government operations hearing, that when I asked him if he knew while he was Secretary what the CIA were doing that had a major impact on foreign policy, he said he thought at the time he was Secretary he did know, but he has subsequently learned that he did not know things that they were undertaking that he should have known. Do you feel today that you, in the light of everything that has transpired, that you do know and are personally acquainted with everything of a major nature affecting foreign policy that the CIA or any other intelligence unit is carrying on of a covert nature or overt nature abroad?
I'd like to say, first of all, that all these investigations have created a somewhat misleading impression of what is going on now. Since 1969, the number of covert operations has been reduced by at least 50% and probably by more. So it is not that there are an enormous number of covert operations going on, and of course, under present circumstances, any president would have to think extremely seriously in weighing the dangers of exposure before he undertakes any. I also believe that there is an area between overt diplomacy and military action, which precisely as military conflicts become less likely and less possible, it is important to retain, for which it is important to retain the capability for covert action. I'm confident that I know intelligence activities that bear on foreign policy. This does not mean that an occasional minor event could not occur, but I would think that all major things bearing on foreign policy, I would be familiar.
You do not feel that the removal of your title in the White House and the National Security Council has in any way impaired your ability to get access to that information and your right to know?
No, I don't believe it has.
Could you tell
I've been told, incidentally, with respect to your previous question, Senator Percy, that we have asked the Justice Department to investigate the cases which you have mentioned in order to determine just what who the parent organizations for this recruiting, and that this investigation is now underway.
Finally, on American involvement, can you tell us how much, up until December 31st of last year, the United States government has spent in Angola in that calendar year, and how much you would like to spend if you had a unilateral decision on this matter in Angola, directly or indirectly, that is, through any neighboring countries, how much you'd like to spend if you had the unilateral power to spend it, authorize and appropriate it and spend it this year? What would be, in your judgment, the right amount for us to expend in that area?
Senator Percy, these figures have, we haven't stated them publicly in the past, but they've been in the press so much. The amount that had been set aside prior to December was something like $32 million. We were asking for another $28 million. We believed, let me explain the strategy we were pursuing in December. In December, we wanted to bring about a military balance, or to put the Soviet Union and Cuba into a position where they could overcome the equilibrium which was foreseeable with those sums only by an effort of a magnitude that would clearly threaten other relationships. And we were accompanying this with parallel diplomatic efforts to structure an OAU resolution that both of us could support, designed to get all foreign intervention out. And we had some hope, some considerable confidence, in fact, that by the end of January this process might be accomplished. And this is why we thought $28 million was enough for that purpose, and why the relationship in the balance of forces to which the chairman referred in his opening statement would apply more to a protracted conflict than to what we had in mind. Now, under present circumstances, where the Cubans have doubled their military force since the middle of December, and where the Soviet Union now has taken public positions which they never took before, it would probably require a considerably larger effort. And therefore, I have stated the problem of overt assistance in a much more tenuous way. I do not think it is in our national interest to produce another confrontation between the executive and the Congress on this issue. And what we have in mind of doing is to sit down with a number of the key members of both houses of the Congress with the figures as they appear to us and see what they think before we make a formal request. And I'm not prepared to make a formal request today.
Mr. Secretary, we have a vote on the floor, and I'll just put the two questions to you that whenever my turn comes up again. What is China's role today, and what has caused them to bring about a change in that policy, if they have? And what was Mr. Brezhnev's response when you put it to him as forcefully as you must have as to the effect that it would have upon our relationships with the Soviet Union if they persisted in this policy of overt intervention in Angola?
Well, I'll answer this after the vote, or do you want me to answer it now?
We'll come right back, and I think it's Senator Casey's turn, and I'll just hold those questions off until the next round.
Senator Charles Percy of Illinois, a Republican, has been questioning the Secretary of State.
The committee will be back in a couple of minutes, and we'll start.
That was Senator Clark, and as you heard from Senator Percy, there is a vote on at the Senate. I don't know what the vote is, but it must be important because everybody has left. So I'm here, and Robert Krulwich has joined me. Thank goodness he's here so that he can talk with me so there isn't a monologue going over. One thing we might mention at the offset is that this is a rather small committee. Well, it's a subcommittee of the full foreign relations. And members of the committee, besides Senator Clark, include Joe Biden, Hubert Humphrey, Gail McGee from Wyoming, James Pearson from Kansas Republican, Robert Griffin from Michigan Republican. Also, George McGovern is sitting in today.
Senator Biden, it seems, is not going to go participate in the votes. He'll resume the hearing and become the chairman. I think we can go right back to Senator
Joseph Biden, a Democrat from Delaware.
I'm fascinated by your appeal to the authority of the Congress throughout your statement.
I beg your pardon?
I said I'm fascinated by your appeal to authority of the Congress, which is throughout the statement that by the failure of the Congress early on to take strong opposition, that it led the administration. I guess it helped you in formulating your policy. Was that the implication of the statement, that by failure for us to vocally in the beginning express opposition, you assumed acquiescence, which in turn helped you in moving your policy decision along to be involved? That always happens when I speak. Turn the lights up.
Let's see now whether it comes on again when I answer. Well, the problem of congressional oversight is complex because, on the one hand, this field has generally been considered one of executive prerogative, in which the Congress exercises a general supervision, but not necessarily approval of each individual action. And indeed, I would say that as we evolve a relationship between the executive and the Congress, the interplay between the day-to-day supervision and the general policy supervision is one that requires a great deal of attention. The fact is that our perception was that we felt we had an obligation to the national interest to begin doing what we thought was the right course. That we thought that if we met what seemed to us opposition in principle that would lead to profound divisions, we would then have an opportunity early in the effort to assess that, either because those who were briefed did not understand what we wanted, what we had in mind, or because they were uncharacteristically reticent. We did not get the impression that there was an opposition in principle of a magnitude that would cause the Congress simply to shut the thing off in the middle. I didn't mean to imply that every single senator who was being briefed agreed. We knew that Senator Clark had a different view, but I would distinguish between the objections he took, which were expressed in an amendment that really was quite compatible with what we thought could evolve, and a flat cutoff of future funds.
I understand better what you're saying. I'd like to. I have some substantive questions. I hope they're substantive questions, but before I proceed with them, I'd like to. You had stated at one point that you gave the sequence of events with regard to congressional briefings as you saw it. I'd like you to have the benefit of knowing what I saw from the other side, and maybe you can understand my concern better then. As early as July, I believe, Mr. Ingersoll briefed the subcommittee, and I think it's date. You have the date. I'm not sure of it, what the date is, but sometime in July. at which time...
We have a list attached to the...
At which time there was... I'm informed that this particular one, July 28th, was not on the list that you submitted. But at any rate, regardless of when it was or when they were, the first time I heard about this, our involvement in Angola in any manner at all, was sometime around that time, and it was relatively small at that time, and the stated objectives were then different than what the stated objectives were at subsequent meetings we had, and different than the amounts of money which were said to be intended to be put in there. My recollection is, and I don't have any notes in front of me, my recollection is the amount was something under $10 million the first time I was briefed, and was told then that the likelihood of it going beyond that amount was just not conceivable. We just had no intention of being involved beyond that. We saw that as a cutoff point, and then each subsequent meeting, and even though each of these briefings which you listed, only several was I in attendance, the staff in turn would come, and the Foreign Relations Committee staff would brief me about what had transpired at the subsequent meetings. Without necessarily trying to elicit a response, from my standpoint, what it looked like was, the first time I was told, it was something which I stated then on the record an objection to, but it was something of a magnitude that didn't seem to be very, very broad, and our major concern at that time expressed in the meeting was one of whether or not, in light of the CIA investigations, it was smart policy for you to conduct a covert activity, and what that would do domestically if that came out. The second area of discussion was what in the heck is South Africa going to be doing, and South Africa wasn't going to be any part of this. We had no knowledge of it at that time, apparently, of their interest in being involved. So we weren't going to, quote, be embarrassed by South Africa. But that's the character in which the briefings and discussions were cast. And then I must admit that at least for Senator Clark and I, newer members of the committee and only members of the subcommittee, you know why we're on the subcommittee. It was an unimportant subcommittee until Angola became an important issue. So we got the African Affairs Subcommittee. So we were the only ones that, initially who were being briefed. And quite frankly, speaking for myself, I wasn't sure, and I'm still not sure, and I'm sure it will become clearer, how to handle a CIA briefing or a State Department briefing that's labeled classified when you object vehemently. I mean, what do? Do you walk out and say, I object? I wasn't sure how you go about that. I'm learning, but I wasn't sure then. And believe it or not, Mr. Secretary, I don't believe in leaks. I think that's a hell of a way to do business, and I'll never do that, as evidenced by a couple reporters out there who asked me on occasion what was said in those meetings, and I wouldn't tell them. But the point being, I was at a loss myself as knowing how to handle it, and I assume that will come with experience. But from one member's viewpoint, that's how it looked. Number one, there was hardly any involvement, and an assurance that there would be no substantial increase in that involvement. Two, that there was no way of it being found out, so there wouldn't be any domestic embarrassment, or there didn't seem any possibility of it because of the amounts and because of the manner in which it was being shipped in. And three, there was no likelihood of any embarrassment as a consequence of association with South Africa, which some of us believe to have I guess most of us believe to have a despicable policy with regard to blacks. At any rate, I just wanted you to have that perspective. And as I understand your statement, and I'm going to try to summarize and see if I understand the thrust of what you're saying. When the point came that the USSR and Cuba intervened on a major scale, we moved from bicycle diplomacy to arms diplomacy. That is, up to now, up to that point you said, and you mentioned in your statement, we supplied everything from bicycles to radios or whatever, and radios. Or was not radio, but I remember bicycles being mentioned, and then, but only as a consequence of their massive intervention and the losses on the part of the factions which they were not backing, did we feel there was a need to escalate our activity. And then it seems to me that you went on to say that, number one, this is a civil war. Is that correct? Do I understand that?
It was a civil war until the Soviet Union and Cuba escalated their role to the point where almost all of the fighting on one side is done by the Cuban forces.
Well, okay. Now, also, I think you said that there is no, at least overwhelming, economic or strategic interest which the United States has in Angola.
There is no unilateral preferred position that the United States seeks in Angola. The United States could live with any Angolan government that emerges out of Angolan processes.
For example, in terms of our strategic and economic interest, if South Africa had been the one to take the role which Cuba and the USSR have taken, the Soviets have taken, we wouldn't feel as compelled to be there, would we? Or any other country but the Soviet Union.
If South Africa, I have to answer this in two parts. If South Africa had played that role, it would have not had the global impact that a Soviet and Cuban action had, but it would have had a very profound African impact. And therefore, we would certainly have opposed and very strongly opposed a unilateral South African intervention on the ground that it would have undermined the moderate African governments like Zambia's if Angola were turned into a South African outpost. So we would have opposed it for different reasons, but dealing with South Africa, we would have had a less international confrontation. It would have been a more manageable confrontation.
Well, the point I'm trying to get to is that it's the global impact that this has that you feel calls for, at least in this situation, our involvement in terms of backing militarily, not in terms of troops or advisors, but in terms of dollars, another faction, and you go at great length, and I think lay out very succinctly your well-known view with regard to what American interests are vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and what the free world's interests are, or chances are vis-a-vis the United States' involvement in
of course, my view with respect to the Soviet Union is a dual-tracked one. I have always believed very strongly that we must seek to improve relations and not base our relations on traditional patterns of diplomacy, because those in the past have always led to war. But I also believe that that policy of relaxation of tensions can succeed only from a position in which the security of all parties is assured and in which neither side seeks to impose a unilateral advantage on the other. So that is a somewhat complex approach.
I believe it is a complex approach, but ultimately, aren't you subscribing to the theory that peace is indivisible, and where, in fact, the Soviet Union is, in whatever way, causing elimination of the state of peace, or being involved in a confrontation, that our security rests upon our countering their actions?
I would make a distinction between the situations such as Vietnam, in which there were substantial indigenous forces and indigenous organization, from a situation in which essentially you are dealing with a foreign intervention at very long distances in areas in which there has been no traditional Soviet, not to speak of Cuban, interest. In that respect, I do believe that peace is indivisible.
Well, I have...
That is to say that if the Soviet Union perceives that it is free to project its influence by military means, then unopposed, that then we will live in a world of great instability. I'm not saying that political competition will not go on. Of course it will. And we have been engaging in political competition in many areas of the world. But the whole effort of the policy of relaxation of tensions has been to limit the scope of this competition to political and perhaps to economic means until it could be turned into a more positive relationship. But if military means become, again, the accepted standard, then eventually all international restraints will disappear.
Well,
That is my concern.
My 10 minutes up. I'd like to pursue that in several other areas if we get to a second round of questioning. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Senator McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
George
Mr.
McGovern.
Secretary, as I understand it, you have argued here this morning that the strategic significance of Angola is really not at issue. That is, the important question is how the U.S. Response affects our credibility as a world power. Is that
Well,
correct?
I would say there is some strategic significance to Angola, and it is certainly a different world from the one that existed 20 years ago when one looks at the emerging string of Soviet bases or areas they can use on both sides of the African continent. But my order of priorities, the concern is the overall impact on the nature of the world in which we live if these methods are permitted to.
Do you think our ambassador to the UN might have slightly overstated the strategic significance of an MPLA victory when he said that it would jeopardize freedom of the seas and constitute a threat to Brazil?
Well, I'm trying to reduce the flow of communications to the State Department, so I am trying to keep controversies to one a week. I would have put my order of priorities in terms of the impact on the world equilibrium and the strategic impact second. Although I would not deny that there is a strategic impact, too.
On page 10 of your statement, Mr. Secretary, you said, "I must note with some sadness that by its actions, the Congress has deprived the President of indispensable flexibility in formulating a foreign policy which we believe to be in our national interest." I think from what you've told us here today and other things that you've said to members of the Foreign Relations Committee, that is a matter of overriding concern with you, is it not?
Well, I believe, Senator, leaving aside all the disputes on specific policies on which serious people can differ, that it is the essence of foreign policy is design, timing, proportion, which requires above all continuity and some overriding conception. And with all respect, the Congress is better organized to take individual decisions than to emphasize those qualities. And how to reconcile those two objectives seems to me one of our big national problems right now. I believe a strong foreign policy requires executive authority. Now, how that is related to congressional supervision is one that we should work out together.
Well, I think the problem with your sadness over Congress depriving you of some flexibility, Mr. Secretary, is based on the fact that history didn't begin with Angola.
That's true.
And that the experience of the Congress in granting too much flexibility has been an enormous disaster in Indochina that almost destroyed the credibility of the United States. Here we really have a posture statement from you that is a carefully thought out position by the administration that the credibility of the United States as a power in the world is really what is at stake here. But I think many members of the Congress who are reluctant to give you the flexibility that you asked for are basing that on a bitter historic experience.
And I understand that. The problem we have is whether we will, it is clear that the pendulum had gone too far in the direction of executive authority, and that led to decisions that were tragic. The danger now is that the pendulum will swing too far the other way for very understandable reasons. But we will be judged not by how well we understand the causes of our actions, but whether we can develop a mode of national action that is relevant to our problems, and whether we can transcend the past sufficiently to find the proper balance between the need of executive authority and the need for congressional supervision. I'm not arguing for a return to the situation that you have described, but I'm also extremely concerned about the tendencies that have, however understandably, developed over the course of recent years as a result of the war in Vietnam, Watergate, and its aftermath. And I think it is a major national problem to find the proper balance between executive authority and congressional supervision in the period in which we are living.
Well, I think, Mr. Secretary, it's not simply a matter of finding a proper balance on procedure, but it's also a question of judgment as to what the foreign policy of the United States ought to be.
Certainly.
Now, you said here a while ago, although it's not in your prepared statement, I hope I'm not misquoting you, that you feel that our country has now reached a consensus that we shouldn't be involved in so-called wars of liberation that are basically of an indigenous quality. And I take it that you were drawing that as a central lesson from Vietnam, that it was, in retrospect, a mistake for us to have been so heavily involved there. But how do you square that with the fact that as recently as a year ago, you and the President were here before the Congress pleading for another $1 billion in arms to try to determine the outcome of that indigenous struggle in Southeast Asia? Or that as recently as this week, the last ambassador out there says it's the fault of Congress that Saigon fell. He was your representative in Saigon, the last man to leave there, yet he's testifying before the Congress that had it not been for the Vietnam Resources Center influencing the Congress, that we'd probably still be standing out there for the cause of freedom in Saigon. How do you square that with the conclusion you give us today that we've learned our lesson in Vietnam?
Last year, we had two problems. One was that the military actions that were then taking place in South Vietnam involved, I forget the figures now, either 18 out of 20 of the North Vietnamese divisions. I know that all except two of the existing North Vietnamese divisions were sent into the South in total violation of the Paris Accords that we had signed in 1973 with North Vietnam and that many other countries had endorsed. So what we were facing there was, if not outside aggression, at least a total violation of an armistice agreement that had been internationally recognized. Secondly, the decisions we faced last year at that time involved also how the United States would conduct itself in what we generally recognized as probably the final phase of a national tragedy, and how the United States should bring this tragedy to an end. And the real difference at the time was between those who believed that we should make every effort to give ourselves the maximum opportunity to evacuate the largest number of Vietnamese and to evacuate the Americans there under conditions of maximum safety, or whether we should simply terminate all of the assistance. And I believe that in the briefings that I gave at that time in executive session to many congressional committees, I made clear that the expectation that we had few illusions about the probable outcome of the military operations that were then going on, and that we were rather concerned about another matter. Now, with respect to assessing who is to blame at what phase of that operation, I do not feel that that is an exercise in which we should now engage, because anyone can always find individual decisions which have caused particular events but it's the overall effort that has to be judged.
Well, my time is up, Mr. Secretary. I'm not interested in trying to make any individual assessment of blame either. I believe in amnesty for all concerned in that miserable war. But I do think that we have to understand that the reluctance of Congress to provide a free hand in Angola or elsewhere is related to history, and that this is not something that's going to be cured overnight.
And the free hand isn't what is needed anyway, but a greater degree of confidence in long-range purposes must be established over a period of time.
Senator Case.
Clifford Case, a Republican from New Jersey.
I think these are very important hearings. I would like to pick up where Senator McGovern was discussing basic questions with you. I do think, if I may say so before I get into that most of your statement, and it's a very broad statement, a very comprehensive one, is pretty much, though, is dealing with threshing old straw. It's threshing old straw. Your complaint that you had told Congress as much as they needed to know on many occasions, and the fact that you regarded your disclosures in effect as stopping them from complaining because they didn't complain at the time. Your feeling that if we hadn't intervened in December, you could have carried it out successfully. We understand how you feel about this. We happen to disagree. We happen to disagree, that's all. I don't want to get into threshing that old straw again. I do want to get to the point for our purposes and yours of some rather basic questions. First of all, I'll leave aside the technical matter of supervision and oversight. That is being dealt with in other areas, and this committee is deeply interested and ought to have an input, and we will, I'm sure. But that's not before us immediately today. It's this question of your belief about the need for the president to have flexibility. This is very basic, I think. I would just like to put out the possibility that in this country of ours, that is just not what we're supposed to have. And that's the difference between the United States of America and everything that had gone before it. Now, I'm not sure that I would say this, but I think at least it ought to be admitted as a hypothesis in our thinking and in our efforts to get together. And it would have several consequences, and one is that you'd never get into an active opposition to a foreign country without doing it in the open. It doesn't always have to be an active war, and therefore it doesn't always have to have congressional approval under the Constitution. But anything that involves money, I think, should have, and it should be done in the open. I'm not, for yielding to the Russians constantly probing and trying to find weak spots, but I think we ought to answer that in an open way. And that flexibility of the kind that you discuss, which implies the ability of the administration to deal with covert activity, just telling a few members of Congress and getting approval, I think all that's fine, but it doesn't answer the question. The real question is whether the American people are going to be involved in responses of a serious nature. And I think that's a very basic question that we have to meet it here, and I think it is involved. And I wish you would comment on this, because I do think that in this country we've got a different kind of an animal from the kind of governmental and sovereign state and an operation in the world than ever went before it. And that this is really what is, in a sense, involved here. Are the people going to continue to do what the Founding Fathers, and I don't apologize for using a quaint old expression, thought that this country was all about?
Well, if you look at American history, I think you will find that in the field of foreign policy, presidents since the days of the Founding Fathers have exercised really unusual discretion. From the Monroe Doctrine to many of the...
But you see, that was an open statement. The world got it, people got it. They could support it, or they could have objected to it at the time.
But it was proclaimed. It was proclaimed before it was ratified by the Congress. It was stated as an American policy.
Yes, but stated openly. I mean, this is the...
Let me separate the question of executive discretion from the question of covert operations, which I will get to, with your permission, separately. I believe an amount of executive discretion is essential in the sense that somebody has to speak for the United States. And when one conducts diplomacy, the expectation of other countries that the President or the Secretary of State or whoever is designated to speak for the United States can in fact deliver on the promises or the threats is essential for the role that the United States has set itself. Now, a wise President and Secretary of State will make certain to get the congressional approval and the public support that he can muster. And therefore, the idea that foreign policy can be designed in total secrecy and carried out without anybody's knowledge is one that is incompatible with our tradition. And I think if we look over the actions of either presidents or secretaries of state, a great effort is devoted to, maybe not enough, but to gaining congressional and public support for policies. Now, there are areas of policy in which are peculiar to the modern period, which have been expressed in the area of covert operations, which present peculiar difficulties. Because when publicly avowed, they can either lead to extreme complexities or become totally unmanageable. And yet, they occur in an area where first our opponents are active, and secondly, which has become, because of the particular aspects of the modern period, especially vulnerable. We have not yet found a good solution for the handling of covert operations. The committees that were briefed were not selected by the administration. They were established by the Congress only last year. It was not the administration which selected whom to brief on Angola. It was the Congress which had established those particular procedures to which we adhered. Now, that, I admit, presents problems which we have to consider. Now, on the basic problem of public support and congressional support for foreign policy, I believe on the main purposes of the foreign policy, fundamental objectives, the fundamental commitments, there has to be total disclosure. On the day-to-day tactics, a certain amount of confidentiality is necessary until at least a point of potential decision is reached, at which, again, the processes of the Congress and of the public must operate. So it is very hard to draw any absolute distinctions, but all democracies in history have had the problem of how to reconcile their democratic procedures with the need for authority, especially in the field of foreign policy, and it's one to which there is no easy answer.
I understand that, of course. But I didn't want to get too deeply into details or even questions as to what the next step is, which we'll be very glad to get your recommendations on. Your only new point here was that you might consider recommending overt assistance. that hasn't become a recommendation at this point, so I didn't question you about it.
I think that the chairman will confirm that I was asked to explain the reasons for our Angola policy.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
And that
I'm
I
not complaining.
responded to his
I think
request.
it's been most helpful to have you here. Also, to give us a chance to explain what the thing had looked like from our side, and to emphasize that we are the same opinion still as to the wisdom of the action that the Senate took. And just one other point before I have to go to vote. I don't feel that an apology is necessary, but the situation was not the same in July as it was later in December.
That is correct.
And a failure to make overt objection, particularly when we were under an injunction of secrecy to what was proposed in July, I never felt, and I do not still feel, stopped us from objecting in December when the situation, we all know what the situation was and how.
Let me make clear. I am not saying that members of the Congress who failed to object at earlier periods had no right to object in December. That is not my concern. My concern is that at a time when we were in the middle of a delicate diplomatic operation, which we believed would take another 6 weeks to complete, whether another means could have been found or whether enough time could have been given to complete this, regardless of whether members of Congress had previously expressed their view. But in any event, this is now in the past, and not a great deal is gained by going over it. But I agree, for example, that Senator Biden's account of what we presented in July is essentially what our perception of it was in July, and that the magnitude of the Soviet effort and the lengths to which the Soviet Union was prepared to go were not clear to us until later in October.
And the deterioration of the situation on the other side, too.
That's correct.
Senator Clifford Case, a Republican from New Jersey, was questioning the Secretary of State. We are at a hearing by the Subcommittee, Senate Foreign Relations on Africa and Angola. Senator Joseph Biden.
They're on their way. I don't know what your schedule is.
I can stay another 20 minutes or so.
Well, they're behind me. They should be here shortly. If I could pursue line of questioning that I had begun before until they come with regard to the destabilizing effect of Angola, dominated by an MPLA dominated by the Soviet Union.
May I make a distinction here, Senator?
Yes, please.
It is not that the United States cannot survive in Angola dominated by the MPLA, and even an MPLA dominated by the Soviet Union. It is rather the principle that is established that the Soviet Union has in effect imposed with 11,000 Cuban troops a government in such a country, and that as a result other countries threatened with the potentiality or the actuality of similar intervention might adjust their policies to it. That concerns us most.
Thank you. I'll yield to Senator Pell.
Thank you very much, Senator. Mr. Secretary, I think so often, I think Senator McGovern touched on this a little bit, the past is obviously prologue to the future, to repeat that pat statement. And I asked the Library of Congress to look into the record of Soviet interventions abroad since World War II. These are figures you know better than I. But there have been 20 nations throughout the world where the Soviets have, rather than succeeding, have failed to either maintain or to expand their influence. And in Africa alone, you have the events that took place, and I'll read the list: Zaire, Ghana, Mozambique, Nigeria, Mali, Egypt, and the Sudan. All areas where the Soviet had a reasonably dominant influence at one point, all areas where they were pushed back. And it would seem to me that in this case, where we all agree there's no strategic or immense American national interest involved, that if the Soviets did move into Angola, did succeed in having a dominant role, did bleed themselves dry in their efforts to do this, and in other parts of the world, that the force of African nationalism is such that in a very few years the Soviets would find that the result would be that Angola would be added to that list of African nations from which they've been pushed out. And why is this not, looking ahead into the future, and you, I know, are much more of an historian than I am, looking ahead into the future, why is this not probably the scenario that will develop if we just sit back and let the Soviets hang themselves?
Well, first of all, going through your list of countries, in Zaire, the Soviet Union was not pushed out without some efforts by the United States. In Egypt, it was at least the surrounding policy of the United States that had some effect on Egyptian perceptions of the utility of sole reliance on the Soviet Union. In the other countries you mentioned, we are talking about Soviet diplomatic influence that had been achieved through economic aid, in some cases through military aid, but through normal exercises of state-to-state relationships. And while we were not happy with it, this was not a matter which we would feel would require the active opposition of the United States. What we face, however, in Angola, and if, as I've said before, the MPLA had come to power in Angola the way the Frelimo came to power in Mozambique, it again would not have provoked any significant American response. What concerns us in Angola is that we are facing 11,000 combat troops in a country like Angola are a massive force. That is a larger force than the entire MPLA possessed at this time last year. I think in March of this year, the MPLA had about, in December of 75, they had about 4,000. In March of this year, they were increased to, or in March of 75, they were increased to, December 74, they had 4,000. In March, they went up to 10,000. And there are more Cubans there now than there were MPLA, that the entire MPLA had in its forces in the middle of the year. That is a military intervention of a significant kind.
Could I interrupt for 1 second there? In connection with those figures, you mentioned the 11,000 Cuban troops, or Soviet and Cuban troops, and earlier you mentioned the $200 million. Would other intelligence services agree with our assessment as to the extent of that intervention?
I would think so. I have no independent means of checking it, but this. I have never seen these figures contested.
Right.
Have you ever seen any?
Thank you.
I have never seen those figures contested. The sum we now have for the total equipment is about $179 million. It's not quite $200 million. So therefore, whatever happens to the Soviet influence there eventually, it is the mere fact that they were prepared to go to these lengths to install a government that must affect the calculations of countries like Zaire, Zambia, all of the Francophone states, as well as of countries in Europe and in Asia. And we have considerable evidence to that. Secondly, if you look at the evolution of Soviet influence in Africa, it is true they have lost in some countries where they had been powerful. But it is also true that if you compare their situation today to what it was 20 years ago, they have been able to sustain an airlift into Angola by using bases in Guinea, Congo-Brazzaville, and elsewhere. And that too is a fact. So if you look at the secular trend, that too is a reality. Finally, what we wanted to do in Angola is to make it as costly as possible for them, along the lines that you suggested, to discourage future adventures of a similar kind.
What I'm trying to understand more clearly is the order of priority, because last year in Portugal, the Soviets were engaged pretty heavily financially, if not with manpower, And in the early 70s, they certainly were engaged in Egypt, where they had SAM missiles pointed directly at ally Israel, and also where they had, I think, 20,000 soldiers. And yet we did not feel compelled to bring this to the point of almost confrontation that the administration would like to do in this case. What would be the difference?
No.
And incidentally, if I could add, thank God we didn't intervene in Portugal, because the good sense of the Portuguese people have handled the situation themselves, apparently, for the time being at least.
Well, one reason we did not want to make this an overt action is precisely to avoid a public confrontation and to permit a solution of it without bringing it to the point of open confrontation. And we would have far preferred to handle the situation in Angola, and by analogy to that of Portugal, in which a combination of the expressions of our concerns plus whatever advice we were able to give helped improve the climate. So I would say, however, as a general rule, that the attempt to expand the Soviet sphere has been most effectively countered when the United States made it clear where the lines were and found itself in a position to take an action relevant to the local situation.
And you think that philosophy, a viewpoint, which was absolutely correct in the years when I was an employee of your department and living in Eastern Europe, and it was correct in the 40s and 50s, still applies in the 70s and 80s?
I would hope that the policy of relaxation of tensions with the Soviet Union reaches a point where the proposition will not have to be tested. But if, in fact, the policy is disregarded to a point, as it has in Angola, I would think it applies, yes.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
We're listening to Senator Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island, and now Senator Jacob Javits of New York.
The challenge is, seems to me, the fundamental policy of the United States, and it is this. If you will look at page 10 of your statement, you will see the words repeated, only if Soviet lack of restraint carries the risk of counteraction. I repeat that. Only if Soviet lack of restraint carries the risk of counteraction. Now, if you then also follow this at page 43 of your statement, and I only use those specifics because you did the statement, so the thoughts are very clearly in your mind, you will see again the kind of the summation of that view. A demonstration of a lack of resolve could lead the Soviets to a great miscalculation, thereby plunging us into a major confrontation, which neither of us wants. Now, question. Is it your belief, and that of the administration policy, that wherever the Soviet moves, hostilely, as it did in Angola, we must commit ourselves to counter, bearing in mind that great nations can't bluff, and that if the Cuban spear point to the Angolan forces that they are spearheading for overwhelms them, that we must back up whatever is necessary in order to let the Soviet know they can't get away with it by using Cuban troops or not. So question I ask you, is it the administration's view that we must counter, whatever it takes, a hostile move by the Soviet where it affects, and I'll take your definition, people who simply cannot resist them and will be overwhelmed and will thereby be governed by some form of communist state?
Well, it is certainly the administration's view that the Soviet Union must not be given any assurance that it can use its military forces in an aggressive way without running a risk of encountering the United States. What we will precisely do in each circumstance That I am not prepared to say as a general principle. But we must certainly discourage the proposition that the Soviet Union has the right to deploy its military forces into other parts of the world, or the military forces of its client states in an aggressive manner without serious risks. Because if we do not do this, we will sooner or later find a situation either of miscalculation or of such an erosion of restraint where we will then have to take much more drastic action under much more serious circumstances.
Now, does that action necessarily have to be action of the quality which the Soviet Union takes? In other words, they are moving with materiel, military materiel, and troops who are their agents. Must we counteract in that place with military materiel and some form of military force if nothing else will do?
Well, that depends on the local situation. We have to react in some relevant form to the provocation. What it is hard to predict from case to case, and I wouldn't insist on one rule for all circumstances.
Well, for example, the Cuba has just been readmitted to the OAS in a sense. Now, she was readmitted because she seemed to be having relatively peaceful intentions toward Latin America. No more Che Guevara activities. Now, Cuba has materially endangered the peace of the world in an extraordinary action, not unequivalent to what brought on the 1962 crisis at which Kennedy called the turn on the Soviet Union and Khrushchev turned his ships around. Why shouldn't we lean on the OAS and on the whole inter-American system to throw out Cuba?
Well, technically, Cuba has not been readmitted to the OAS. Technically, what the OAS has done is to vote to ratify its existing practice, which was that any state in the hemisphere had the right to reestablish relations with Cuba at its own discretion. But it is not readmitted. Cuba has not been readmitted specifically to the OAS. The problem we have, it is our impression, and I'd be interested also to get the Senator's impression from his trip to Latin America, that several Latin American states are profoundly concerned about the...
You want him kept? Ask him if he, excuse me, ask him if he wants the witness kept. Go ahead, Mr. Secretary. How much time do you have?
About at most 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes.
Are profoundly concerned about Cuban actions and what it may foreshadow in the Western Hemisphere. At the same time, there are also many countries that for their own domestic reasons, their own sense of insecurity, may not be prepared to make great public declarations about this. I'm planning to go to Latin America next month, and I will get a better sense of the real state of view in Latin America at that point. But I already know of several Latin American countries that are profoundly concerned about what is going on with Cuban forces in Africa.
Mr. Secretary, my own impression, and I've just been there, is that you would probably find the same division in Latin America that you found with the Organization of African Unity, about even. And it is my considered judgment that the United States should nonetheless denounce what is being done, demand that the OAS revoke its resolution, and have it out. I think that's one of the things we're learning. If we're going to be outvoted, then we might as well do it fighting for what we think is right. And secondly, Mr. Secretary, isn't the same thing true of NATO? Now, NATO has sedulously avoided the proposition that anything outside the NATO geography is its business. Now, I know Europe is very weakened and very worried about oil, but it too, with our indignation, can be gotten to stand up stronger than it has. And I'll tell you this, as one senator who voted against Angola and the Angolan involvement, if we had had any help, if we had had the least demonstration that others were with us, you might have gotten a very different result. But the fact is that I think the Congress, it's just my own feeling as one senator, has just about had it with a proposition that it's up to us, everybody will hold our coat, but we have to do it alone. Now, that somehow or other, that nut has to be cracked, and it will never be cracked unless we stand up to it, because we are the leader, whatever our decriers may say everywhere, and even the Secretary's testimony emphasizes that. We remain the leader. They all look to us.
No question. But in defense of our NATO allies, I must say that I met with the NATO Council in December, just at the early part of December, and there was a very large support for the policies we were then pursuing, and some, I would say, not announced assistance, not announced for the same reasons that we were trying to keep our support covert at that time. I must say again, last week when I briefed the NATO Council on my return from Moscow, I found 13 of the 15 foreign ministers came to Brussels, which was an unusual demonstration of solidarity. And I would think that the basic analysis that I've presented here as to the nature of the Angola problem would be shared by the overwhelming majority of my colleagues in NATO.
Mr. Secretary, we heard...
I agree. We are the leaders, and we have a special responsibility.
But I think what is coming through to the world, Mr. Secretary, is that we have a responsibility to be joined with others. And our special responsibility, as you call it, it seems to me, if premised in their minds on the fact that they can tell us sotto voce, or in the privacy of the Chancery, that they're with us, as so many Asian nations did during the Vietnam War, they'd better find out that that doesn't work anymore. Just as Senator Case made the strong point with you, and it is strong, that for good or ill, Congress is asserting a constitutional authority which it has not asserted in years. So it is my judgment, in a public sense, that our people are going to take the grief of making it overt instead of covert. There are lots of advantages to make it covert. The Russians demonstrate that. But it's not our ballgame. We're going to have to make it overt, but they have to realize that they got to declare themselves with us, and that the quiet conversation will not do.
But again, I really have to say, in defense of our NATO allies who for the first time in a long time have been supporting us, the British Foreign Minister, the German Foreign Minister, and the French Prime Minister all made statements last week very much along the lines of what I'm saying here.